morning. My name is Dr. Jim Klauber. I'm president of Hagerstown Community College, and I want to welcome each and every one of you to this Facebook Live event where we have a community discussion on race and racial equity. I've lived here in Washington County, Maryland for about 2 years now, and I tell you, I know each and every one of these panelists, and I cannot think of a more committed group of people to our community and to our state than those members who are sitting here today. And I'm very glad that each and every one of them agreed to come together for this community discussion. This is a partnership with Hagerstown Community College and the Chamber of Commerce. We consider ourselves to be vital partners to the community, but also vital partners with the Chamber of Commerce, with which we do numerous activities to advance Hagerstown and Washington County. It's now my great honor and privilege to introduce the CEO of the Washington County Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Paul Fry. Paul?
Well, thank you, Dr. Klauber, and it's again my pleasure to be here on behalf of the Chamber and the business community. We want to thank Dr. Klauber and his team here at HCC, in particular, Dr. Christine Oljalati, the Dean of Students, and the AV team. This has been a great setup for us, so thank you all for your work with us in partnership. And I want to thank Tony Bowie for moderating, whom you'll meet here shortly. Thank our panelists. As Dr. Klauber said, a great diverse group here of community members in Washington County. And thank all of you for watching here this morning. You know, this is a marathon, not a sprint, this conversation about racism and racial equity, and we're looking forward to being part of a number of conversations here in Washington County with other groups. You know, the Chamber, I'm not shy saying this, that any community is driven by the private sector. If you don't have a thriving private sector, business community, you don't have a good, successful community. You do also have to have a great quality of life. And you have to have a great quality of life for all citizens. And so part of our work here today is make sure we enhance the quality of life here in Washington County, and we're looking forward to this conversation. And with that, I want to introduce Tony Bowie. Tony is managing partner with Max Life LLC, a coaching and training organization that leads critical workplace conversations. For over 20 years, she has led and supported organizations in diversity and inclusion, sexual harassment prevention, and employee and organization development. A member of the Washington County Chamber of Commerce, Tony holds a BA in communications and an MA in psychology. Among other areas of expertise, and there are many, Tony is certified as a diversity executive. Good morning and welcome, Tony.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. I'm going to also say just welcome to our panelists, everyone who's out there in the audience listening to us. I thank you very much, and thank you for having me be a part of this conversation. I've also got to go back and say another thank you to the sponsors for this. We wouldn't be doing this if it were not for that great partnership that we just heard about with Hagerstown Community College and Washington County Chamber of Commerce, so thank you again. You know, on May 25th, the world witnessed a videotaping of the death of Mr. George Floyd. He was killed when a police officer from Minnesota held his knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. From that, and even because of prior things that have happened, there was a global outcry. And the global outcry was for justice, it was for equality, it was for respect, and so many other things. This conversation is just one of the things that has come out of that. And there have been several conversations around. We're hearing people say we've got to have these difficult conversations. I look at this as really an intro to the difficult conversations. As we go through today, our goal is very simple. It really is just to provide a safe space so that we can feel free to share stories and then listen, ask questions and then listen, gain a little more understanding of different points of view, get an idea and maybe have a little more increased empathy for what it's like to sometimes walk in other people's shoes. So it's a very simple goal here today, and that's really about it. Now, I get the opportunity to introduce one by one the panelists up here. And so I'm going to do that, and I'm going to start right over here with Miss Sila. And over here, we have Sila. Sila Bartel is president of ICTM, a local language translation service, current 6-year Washington County Chamber of Commerce board member. Sila leads the Western Region Committee of the Maryland Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, Sila. And I am going to read straight from my paper as I do these introductions. And next we have Miss Stanphney Marshall Caldwell, an HCC student. And here's what they say about you, okay? So listen to this. Stanphney has been an amazing student parent, student leader, and even student worker at HCC for the past few years. She's very involved in the Hagerstown community. We also have with us Chief Joey Kifer, Hagerstown City Chief of Police. Also a lifelong native of Hagerstown and sworn HPD officer since 1992. He has served as patrolman, field training coordinator, patrol supervisor, criminal investigation supervisor, patrol sector commander, and commander of the Special Services Bureau before being named chief in 2018. Thank you.
Thank you.
And next we have coming up here, Mr. Spencer Jackson. Spencer is the Saturday campus pastor of Lifehouse Church, and he is a local music artist. Can't wait to hear you. And over here, we have Washington County Sheriff Doug Mullendore. Sheriff Mullendore was first employed as a police officer with the town of Boonesboro in 1974 and worked there until 1978. He was hired by the sheriff's office in 1982 and was elected sheriff and has been serving in that capacity since 2006. Thank you. And next we have Mr. Mark Harrell, president of CNB Bank, and also a current chamber board member and incoming chamber board chair, which begins on September 1st. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And then we have Ms. Carolyn Brooks, HCC Board of Trustees member. Ms. Brooks is active in the community, currently serving on the boards of Hagerstown Community College, and she has been serving in that capacity since 1993 with the distinction of being the first person of color appointed. She also serves with the City of Hagerstown Housing Authority, the Brook Grove Foundation, the Thomas Kennedy Center, and she's the founder of Character Counts Coalition right here in Washington County. So thank you, everyone. This is the second conversation, at least, that has been had here in Hagerstown, that has been broadcast, I should say it like that. And the first one was with the GHC, and I'm mentioning them for a couple of reasons. One is that I'm going to follow suit from their moderator, Patrick Grash. One of the things that Patrick asked for was for everyone to have grace. And so I'm going to ask for grace also. I'm asking for grace with us here in the room and also out there in our listening audience. This is or can be a pretty vulnerable situation that you all have volunteered for. So I'm very grateful. I hope everyone out there is grateful and that there is just grace all around us. As we go through the conversation, we may hear some good, some bad, some ugly, and some indifferent. And we're just going to take that and we're going to listen and listen and listen. And we're going to learn from it. My role as moderator is to offer a question or two and just simply to keep the conversation going. I think our time together is going to go fairly quick, watching that clock pretty well. And we don't have any buzzers up here, so we can't say time's up, but we have to just be simply respectful for how long we talk. We want to make sure that everyone has ample time to share. All agreed? Okay, okay. So I get the opportunity also, as the person who's been talking and saying we got to watch our talking, I get the opportunity to really just ask the first question. And it's one that I really want to know about. You volunteered to be a part of this panel, and it's a tough time. And I want to know, and I think others might want to know, what makes you want to be part of this conversation like this? I don't have any order that I want to go in, so whoever wants to answer that first, we'll go there. Thank you.
So I think the reason I'd like to be here, first of all, I want to learn more about the issues at hand, and not being a person of color, to understand some of the issues and where those issues lie. But just as importantly, I also want to relay that not all law enforcement are the same. I think any law enforcement officer that watched the George Floyd video will tell you that they do not condone any of that. I find it very appalling that anybody within the law enforcement community would perform an act like that. And that I think in our community, acts of that nature would not be something that occurred. If it did, you know, we would bring it out and deal with it immediately. You know, both the Hagerstown Police Department and the Sheriff's Office are CALEA certified, which is the Commission on Accreditation for Law Enforcement Agencies, which means that we follow national policies, and that we get audited on those policies. Not just that we have the policies, but that we act on those policies and obey those policies according to standards. And the Sheriff's Office just received our on-site accreditation back in the middle of July. And so we're very proud of that. There's only about 25% of the agencies in the United States that have that accreditation. And the Chief and I have both talked, and we believe that that would be one good starting place, is to make sure that everybody has the same type of policy, they're following national policies, and they get audited to make sure that their officers are following that policy.
Thank you very much.
Tell me, I'll go.
Carolyn.
On the other side, to respond to what the sheriff has just said, it is important to have conversations. And I think that the more that I can share about my experiences and my beliefs brings a better understanding in the community. Because a lot of times people have formed judgments and opinions, and I think that conversation is the best exercise that we can use to communicate to each other. That way, Doug, you can understand why sometimes I get emotional and upset about one thing, and you look at me like, well, what's the problem? You know. So historically, there are a lot of things that we need to share about our ancestry, our heritage, why we think the way we do. And then at the end of the day, you realize that we are more alike than we are different, but you have a better understanding of my position.
Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you very much. Who would like to go next?
I'll go next.
Thank you, Paul.
So I think these discussions are very important for the whole community. I represent the law enforcement part of that community, but also represent a citizen here in this county. So getting to understand where everyone's lives have brought them, much like what Carolyn just talked about, allows me as a human being to better myself in the community. But from a law enforcement perspective, it gives me the opportunity to better understand what I'm walking into in certain circumstances. As Carolyn mentioned, sometimes she's upset about things that doesn't quite make sense. These conversations may allow me to ask a better question, to figure out where she's coming from in a situation that maybe from the outside you look at and go, why is this person so upset in this situation? That doesn't lead to some kind of use of force or some other alternative reaction that we in law enforcement may take and go towards. So I just think lifting up our community, everyone in our community, especially our minority community, learning about all those things that have been put in place over the course of history here in the United States that we don't really get taught. I brought this up at the last panel discussion, zoning ordinances and things that were put in place, back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s to try to keep African Americans from owning homes and things. That's something I never learned about or knew about until this year. I learned about that, and so I've been trying to educate myself on a lot of that history and how that reflects on the community that we service and those barriers that have been put in place for people of color over the course of generations that put them behind and has that. So where that anger and that frustration comes from is very important for us as citizens and really for law enforcement. So I'm very encouraged about these discussions.
I appreciate your saying that there are some things that you're just learning this year. There's so much that so many of us have not been taught, and it's through research and listening and reading and doing all that extra work, because it didn't come always in our school books. It just wasn't there. So thank you. Who wants to go next?
I can go next.
Okay.
I felt like it was important for me to be here because, like I always say, I like to give a voice to the voiceless. If you know me, a lot of times I'm the person that's talking. My friends are pretty quiet. So if there's something going on, they'll be like, oh, well, Stanphney, this is happening. Maybe you should say something. So I definitely felt that it was important for me to be here, not only just for myself and my family, but for my friends, for the people that look up to me, things like that. I really feel like as people of color, women of color, we're really underrepresented when it comes to conversations like this. And a lot of times people they say what they think we're thinking. Oh, well, maybe she feels this way or maybe she feels that way. But I feel like if enough of us get enough courage to speak up and tell them exactly what we're thinking and how we're thinking, and that's how things start to change. And that's why I felt like it was important to be a part of the panelists.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Yes, Ms. Sila.
Okay, thank you. I felt it was important for me to be here because the Hispanic population here in Washington County is growing here in Hagerstown and continues to grow. And the Hispanic population have been victim of prejudice and discrimination for many, many years. We are discriminated based on our accent, on how we look. I'm Hispanic, but I look different from other Hispanics. So the ones who look more Latino are more, how would say, their chances of being a stereotype are more than me. Why? Because, I have an accent, but when I talk, they don't see me as a Latina. They say, where are you from? Granted, my ancestry is from Spain, Galicia, Spain. So I don't look like someone from Guatemala or other Central American countries. They get the brunt of it, and I felt that I should be here to explain why we go through, based again on how we look and how we talk, how good our English is, So I think it's time also to open up and talk about those situations.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Got 2 more left.
Well, good morning. I know better than following a pastor, so, so I'll go ahead and speak. Good morning, and I too want to thank Dr. Klauber and his staff here for hosting this event, Christine and you and the AV team here, and our leader at the chamber, Paul, great work putting this together. I was excited about the opportunity to join in this conversation, and then I was equally encouraged, and maybe even more encouraged when I saw who the panelists were and what a great disparity across the board, and very different views that we have on life. When you think about the unacceptable racial disparities, and whether that's health, wealth, income, education, what role do we play as the financial services industry? And so to come to this conversation and for it to be a healthy conversation, I kept thinking the word listen. Listen, I've done a lot of listening, and the more I talk, the less I can listen. And so, Tony, I really appreciate it. I wanted to keep track of how many times you use the word listen, and I think that's really critical for my role. Our team has been talking a lot about what we've learned since May 25th, and how we may be able to continue to enhance what we're currently doing as part of the solution and be change agents. So we kind of view our mantra that we've been talking about in our shop is, we believe every person in our community should have equal access to economic prosperity. And so what is our role in that as the kind of facilitators of the flow of capital? And so that's why it was so important for me to come here, hear this, listen to this, hear the various views, and continue to build on my education. So I appreciate the opportunity. I really appreciate the panelists being part of this, and appreciate the Facebook community who's listening in on this, and welcome those questions. And I'm especially thankful that I didn't have to follow Pastor Spencer.
We appreciate you too, Mark.
And on that note, I promise I did not bring this first question home so I could give any kind of a sermon, I promise. I'm off the clock. So I don't even think twice whenever I'm asked to be a part of opportunities like this, why I wanted to be a part of this panel today. First of all, even if I didn't even have anything valuable to bring to the conversation, I was going to sit here and twiddle my thumbs on camera because I want to show that I actively support and applaud my city and my community for taking this head on. And I also wanted to sit specifically on this panel because, Tony, I'm glad you referenced the actual date. All of these events are following from the most recent hot event, which was what we saw happen to George Floyd, but we're over 2 months removed from that. And I want to sit on this panel because we did not just quickly change the channel. Everybody's fear about us taking this thing head on and doing something different was that we will change the channel in a week. And if this is a bigger problem than a week long, then it's going to take longer than a week or a month even to face it. Because it's not even a problem-solving situation. It's just a journey of growing to be a better community and country. So I'm glad that we're 2 months later are still having the conversation to this extent. Look at this panel and look at the extent that we're going. We care about this. Personally, also, I wanted to be involved in this discussion and be on this panel because I feel like I bring certain representation. Stanphney, I like what you said. You definitely feel like your part is to be a voice for the voiceless. And I was kind of just cycling through the voices that I represent. I represent the faith community. Obviously, I'm here as a pastor. I represent, when you mentioned me being an artist, I'm a hip-hop artist. If there's any culture that has expressed direct issues with police, with the problems in our nation, hip-hop pulls no punches. So I represent that community. And then even going down into that community, I'm here, not on my own record, and the chief can attest to that, but I also represent voices that I deeply care about that are in the cycle of where survival and poverty are one of the symptoms of our racial inequality, and it definitely is a painful uphill climb, and so I represent those voices. And then also, I always feel compelled and called equally to be involved in these discussions simply because of my biological makeup. I come from an interracial family. I'm both black and white, and like I joke about it, but I mean it. I feel like I have a conviction to be a representation of what happens when we get this thing right. Like if we come together like we're supposed to, you might actually get a good product. And so I'm very unity driven. It's a part of who I am. And so when I see these kind of discussions, if I'm not invited, I might invite myself. Yeah, you know, so thank you to everyone viewing, and thank you to the chamber and for everyone involved, HEC, everyone involved putting this together. I'm very happy to be a part of this discussion.
And thank you very much. I'll say this, I appreciate the one of the words that you just used, journey. This is a journey. We have less than 90 minutes here together. We're not going to solve the problems, but we're just going to hopefully learn at least one extra thing in these 90 minutes. So who has a question? Who would like to have another comment?
Tony.
Yes, ma'am.
I was really excited about this conversation, and so excited. I've been putting notes in my phone because there's so many things that I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
Journey.
I
would recommend that everybody visit the Museum of African American Art, or History, I'm sorry, in DC.
Mm-hmm.
I went there and it was quite an experience. I thought I knew it all.
Mm-hmm.
The journey. I was so emotional when I went into the area where they recreated the hull of a ship. Saw my ancestors stacked up like logs. I left that angry, emotional, wondering how anybody could possibly do that to other living, breathing human beings. And I couldn't stay in that area for very long. I just couldn't take it. That's something that if you witness it and maybe you haven't before had any information, no history, there's nothing in our, I went through school and didn't get any of those stories, didn't see any of those pictures. But I think that whole experience at that museum would be so enlightening for anyone to travel through there. The journey, I mean, we come to, Washington County, Hagerstown is a very unique area. I was born and raised here, but then I lived in Illinois for 8 years. And a lot of times I say, there were things that I thought about my hometown, love my area, I love this area. But when I was away and came back, I was like, it's really true, The population of color is small, and so a lot of times overlooked, or as someone said, someone else is speaking for what they think we need or want, or why we're angry, or why we're emotional. There are so many nuances in Hagerstown, the naming of streets. People come from out of town and they're like, well, why is it this name here, and then it's the same street continues and it's another name? So there are a lot of things that need to be discussed and talked about and cleared up, clear the way for us to be able to relate to each other honestly and openly. I mean, I have been fortunate enough to have a wonderful relationship with the police department. Joey and I are good friends. We've known each other a long time. The sheriff and I have been good friends. I'm one of the fortunate ones who, I guess my persistence is like, okay, I'm going to live here. This is my hometown. My family has history here, and I'm going to make the best of it. And it has worked for me. And I've always felt strongly that I need to be the one to represent if nobody else is there. And if nobody else is invited, I can make a call and say, well, I hear this is happening. Or if there's something going on, I'll say, look, I need to share this with you. So I've been fortunate, but there are a lot of people who are voiceless. And that's why my position is being on the college one day of the month, and then down at Housing Authority another day of the month. I mean, it's a 180. My life is a 180. And I see people who are afraid to speak up versus people who have no idea what's going on in those communities. And sometimes people can be judgmental about those types of communities. But, I mean, conversation, you cannot talk long enough to really make an impact unless you spend time and you're willing to be honest and open and ask the questions that you have about me that you're curious about. And I can say, well, why do you think that way? Or what's that all about? Or where are you coming from? So back to my first point, the journey starts in the hull of a ship with people who are treated less than human, and when they got to this country, treated like property. So if I get upset, that's why.
I think one of the things you mentioned is speaking up and asking questions, and I think the barriers that we've had there up until George Floyd has been that our communities of color didn't know how to speak up. They didn't know how to have that voice. And I think through protests and through that is one avenue that they knew that this country knows how to do. But I think to move this forward is going to be to figure out new ways to have that voice active in everyday life and in everyday situations, and not just at a protest, and not just at an event, not just at a panel discussion, because the change isn't going to happen just having a 90-minute conversation, like you said. The change is going to happen when Spencer and I have a conversation, when we see each other, and we have that conversation to talk about how we can do things in partnership, or how we can just listen to each other about, you know, our issues going on in our life. You know, from, you know, I could talk to him and say, man, I had a really bad day, you know, something happened here, you know, with my job, with what's going on. And from a law enforcement perspective, he could listen to that and maybe add to that to help me, and then vice versa, doing the same thing the other way around. So that journey is important. And I haven't had a chance to get down to the museum. My wife and I have talked about it, but I had an experience that I think I can relate to. My wife's from, her family's from the Czech Republic and from Poland. And so we visited family several years ago over in Poland, and I went to Auschwitz. And my wife had never been there. And her relative took me there, and we went. And it was a very moving moment to be there. I was glad that I went. I don't want to go back, because just being in the place where you saw the pictures and the history that's there, it's different to experience it in that real-time kind of live perspective. So I'm encouraging anyone to go down to the museum. I know that experience hit me hard, and I'm anticipating I'll feel very similar if I go down to the African American History Museum. So I think the journey is, the conversation needs to change how we have the conversation, and that conversation needs to be real-time, organic, and in the moment, and not just like this. These need to continue, but we need to get our society to have those conversations a little more real-time.
Okay. I did go to the African American Museum, and I've got to go back, because you can't see it all and take it all in one time. It's such an event. It's such an event. And when you do see some of what happened in slavery, you know, I'll say this. That's the root of where we are. And we have not taken care of the root. And until we actually take care of the root and are willing to go back, we're gonna continue to have different problems. Slavery is just a big part of America's history that America has just wanted to push under the rug. And a piece or a part of the Americans know it, and then another part doesn't know it as well. And so that's a great big clash there. We've got to learn it. We've got to understand it. We've got to understand what the implications are even to today. And one implication might be how people do or don't speak up so much. When people spoke up years ago, that meant death in so many ways. So some people have been silenced to a degree, and I'm just so grateful for those who are coming out and talking. And it's been happening all along. We just haven't seen it like this. So I'll be quiet, because that was one of the things I asked for. Who would like to offer? And I forget to take my mask off when I'm talking.
I'll go. One of the things that took me back and really struck home to me when we had our conversation with the Greater Hagerstown Committee, Reggie Turner said something that just hit me at the time. And he said that while everybody celebrates July 4th as Independence Day, not everybody was independent. And that's very much true. And it's not something that I thought about at the time, but I've thought a lot about it since that time. And how true that is. And the opportunities growing up, and what I've experienced as opposed to what other people have experienced is totally different. And I think that's a conversation that needs to happen, even in the business community, and how they can help to change that by giving opportunities as well. The financial industry, as Mark had mentioned earlier, just having these types of conversations and being able to understand the issues, the true issues, and how we can work as Americans, all of us, to correct that is a conversation that needs to continue and move on.
Thank you, thank you.
I'd just like to add, I heard you say that a lot of times people of color don't know how to speak up, and then you mentioned how in the past speaking up equals deaf. Like a lot of times we just weren't allowed to speak up. And I think a lot of times when people start speaking up, people automatically assume that they're being disrespectful or they're being hostile. Like I know I'm really passionate when I talk. So sometimes I can come off aggressive, but I'm not aggressive. I'm just passionate. And if I see something that's not right, then of course I want to say something. And I think that's a lot of the problem too, is like a lot of times people of color get dismissed as, oh, they're just being aggressive or they're just being angry. And it's not just that we need to learn to speak up. Maybe sometimes people need to learn to listen a little more. Like maybe that person who's irate isn't really irate. They're not angry at all. They're just hurting and they want to be heard. And the only way they're being heard is if they're yelling, they're raising their voices, they're screaming. Because when you're just standing there and you're trying to talk to somebody, they'll walk right past you. It's been plenty of times where I'm not ashamed of where I'm from. Like right now, I live in public housing. And so it can be someone, I could be outside of my porch and they'll walk right past me. But then I can be here at work and they'll stop by and they'll want to speak to me. Those are the type of things that happen all the time. Like if you see me, even at church, I go to Lifehouse. Like I can be at Lifehouse and I can bump into someone and we're having a whole conversation. But they could be coming to my neighborhood to drop something off or pick something up. And they'll walk right by like, oh, I didn't know you lived here. And I feel like that's a big part of the problem too. It shouldn't matter if I live over on Dewey Avenue or if I live in Frederick Manor. If you want to talk to me, like my voice should matter. What I'm saying should matter. It shouldn't matter if I'm screaming and crying. I feel like that's a different approach too. Like the person that's screaming and crying and upset, how about we go talk to her? How about we see why she's upset, why she's screaming, why she's crying? Because maybe if a couple months ago when she was trying to say, hey, I live in this place and it's not the best, no one's batting an eye. But now something's happened to her son or her daughter or something's happened in the neighborhood and now she's upset, so now let's listen. So I don't necessarily think that we have to learn how to talk. I think it's everybody. Like maybe we should listen. Maybe we should go knock on those doors and get the opinions of the people, you know, who live on Frederick Street. Because like I said, I just really feel like it is different. Like me being at home and sitting on a porch and watching my kids play and someone come in and like come to the community center and doing like a food drive. They're like, oh, you want some food? You know what I mean? Like the conversations are different versus, oh, Stanphney, oh, you go to HCC, we know a bunch about you. Like, can we have this conversation? So I really feel like we just have to start listening. I feel like we have to listen to people, whether they're screaming or whether they're quiet. That's just what I wanted to add.
Thank you, thank you.
And Tony, a lot of times, I know I talk too much sometimes, but I'm really excited about this opportunity. Piggybacking on your comment, personal story. I mean, years ago, my husband had a brand new Corvette, burgundy reddish color Corvette, and he thought it was fun that I would drive it. Not that I was particularly interested in it, but I drove it. But an experience that I had that was really unsettling. It was in the evening, late evening, dark, and I was driving around, and I noticed that there was a police car following me. I was by myself driving the car. Wasn't speeding. I wasn't doing anything wrong because I didn't want anything to happen to that car. But I started to make some turns through not my neighborhood anymore, just to see if I really was being followed. And it kept following me and following me. Finally, put the lights on, pulled me over, and I stopped. I knew I wasn't doing anything wrong. And so in my mind, it's like, okay, what is this about? Is it because I'm a young black woman in a brand new Corvette, which I'm not supposed to have probably, in his opinion? And so I said, I was polite. I said, why are you stopping me? And it was like, well, you were peeling wheels. And I'm like, doing what? I don't even know how to do that. And so that set a tone for me. I mean, I was very young at the time. And so it set a tone. Now, fast forward years later, I'm working for the governor's office and based in the police department. I get to know police now, because actually I hesitated applying for that job because I don't know anything about the police. I've never been arrested. I don't really want to know anything about the police. I wanted to just stay away. But that was a really good opportunity, a good experience for me, because I got to know the inner workings of of what police do, but it didn't make what happened to me right. And it was a bad experience that set the tone for future relationships and thoughts about law enforcement. So, there are so many personal stories that I can tell about things that have happened, but
Sure.
I wanted to share that one just to show I wasn't doing anything.
Yeah.
And got pulled over. Did he want to see the car? Did he wonder why I had the car? Did I steal the car? Or, all kinds of things. So that's
Thank
the
you.
way it worked.
Thank you for sharing. Yes, ma'am. And then
I want to share a personal experience. I'm sorry. And after I say this, you probably will judge my age, but that's okay.
It's okay.
Back in the late 60s, I went to apply for a job in Washington, D.C. And I have an accent. My accent was even thicker. I learned English in Cuba. I didn't learn it here, but I came with a thicker accent. So when I went to apply for this job, the gentleman said to me, without even looking at my resume, looking at my qualifications, he said to me, with your accent, the only job you're going to find is to be a cleaning woman. And I was like, that was my first experience on prejudice and discrimination. He was basing my qualifications based on my accent. Didn't even look. So, old, timers, I was taught well. I got up, I thanked him for his time. And not that being a cleaning woman is an honest job, but it was not what I was qualified for. It was not what I wanted to do. So I continued applying for jobs. And my first job here in U.S. was working for a bank. Proof department, the beginning. But what they saw, they look at my qualifications. They ignore my accent, okay? And yes, I have seen a lot of discrimination and prejudice, but I have also seen a lot of people who helped me along the way, okay? People who saw me as a person, saw me qualified for the position, and that's what I am where I am today. That's why I am here. If I had allowed that man, if I had said, well, with my accent, all I can do is be a cleaning woman, he would have destroyed my life, intentionally or unintentionally. But unfortunately or fortunately, I'm one of those people don't give up easily. And I just, and that's always been in the back of my mind, and that's why I feel so strongly about helping children, boys and girls, you know, to get a good education. And I'm passionate about it because education is the key to open the doors to a better life. And and that was back in the 60s, okay? So the prejudice and discrimination against Hispanics is being for many, many years, you know. So it's something that we've been working on, and we will continue to have to work on it.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm so glad that you had that extra determination, that extra drive. And that's what so many of us find that we have to have is that extra. We got to go extra, extra, extra. Thank you for sharing. Thank you.
Yeah, that comment was like a kick, I'm not going to say, but you're not going to do this to me.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of my father's in teaching. He always said, if you want to advance, it's up to you. But don't let anybody get on the way of who you want to be.
And I'm gonna just say this one more time because I want to make sure everybody kind of hears this. It's the extra that we often have to go in order to get where we want to be. Thank you. Spencer?
And Tony, you know, the extra is what we do with our children. And I mean, I've heard that, you know, well, we have to be 120% where versus, you know, somebody else can only be 100%. And the extra now is that conversation that moms are having with their sons about you have to be very, very and extra careful if you're pulled over or if you're facing a situation. So that extra is really, it's always been there and it's still there. You know, we have to, people of color have to go that extra mile and make that extra effort, maybe be the first one to approach a conversation or the first one to engage in something. So extra. These words today are important.
They're just coming out.
Extra.
They're just coming out.
And especially with boys also, but girls have a tendency to have low self-esteem. And that's what destroys a lot of lives.
It does. It does. Thank you. Thank you.
Did you say we could fire out a question, Tony? If
You
you
can
wanted
fire-
to? Okay. So Carolyn, as you and Sila, as you guys were sharing, and thank you for sharing your experiences, it made me want to ask another question. One, because the thing that I've noticed when we're in the discussions like these is since our incident that we are springboarding off of was a police incident, unfortunately, and I don't mean a pun on this, the police have gotten the black eye as far as like the worst case scenario where this happens. Obviously because the police have to use force. And so if force is involved in where these issues are happening, it's going to look the worst. But it's not the only place where anything systematic or anything that is deep-rooted from our original American sin of slavery, and if there's anything still connected to that, the police are going to get the brunt of it. So not to remove the responsibility from the police, but I want to make sure we're not just staying there. So Sila, that's why I'm glad, Sila, that you talked about discrimination in like as you were applying for a job, because I don't want to put you on the hot seat, so you can block this off. But Mark, I wanted to ask you a question, if I can, because I like what you said of why you were involved, that you feel like economic opportunity is important for everyone. If you said that right, if I don't want to misquote you, because what I like to also do is say, guys, this is everything, and I want to make sure that our conversation doesn't only stay at the place where it happened the worst. It's always going to look the worst when the police are involved because there's force involved, but it's just as painful. It's just as painful to be told you can't have a job because of your accent. It may not involve physical violence, or it may not involve you being arrested unjustly, but it's just as painful and can wreck your life internally. So it doesn't only happen in law enforcement, it doesn't only happen for a job, but like the parts that people don't understand are there's other systems in play. There's other places where power and control can be selective for whatever reason. And so, Mark, when I'm kind of asking you gently, it's because I'm curious. I want to know. And also they're coming from a victim standpoint. And Mark, maybe you have a perception from almost like what actually part of the solution of the problem is like the bystander who's not affected by this but does not think it's right and has the power to actually do something. Because that's what probably our mixed viewers are. Some of our viewers right now are either can relate to Carolyn and to Stanphney and Sila with being on that end. And I want to know where else from someone who actually has a position to do something, whether because they're white or just have the opportunity, have maybe, and also in other areas besides law enforcement, has maybe we've seen a problem here and say, well, we're going to do something about this. Mark, have you ever seen that or have been or aware of that, or where are other areas where we need to be conscious that, hey, racial discrimination or even prejudice or just ignorance plays a part in all areas of our community?
Yep.
It's a big question. Sorry, dude. You
Well,
didn't want to follow
yeah.
Pastor, but I hit you with a tough question.
No, thank you. He was going to make me do it before the end of it. So, Spencer, thank you. It's an excellent point, and I'm glad you brought it up. And I've known Carolyn a long time, and maybe some of hers rubbed off on me because I too took some notes and did some research, and I appreciate that, Tia. I'll share with you, and let me back up and say it. One of the things that if we, a definition of success, I believe, will include trust. And I think for Stephanie and for others who have shared, the trust that when you're walking into a bank, the trust when you are approaching law enforcement, that you can have a healthy, open conversation and you don't have to do 120%. Versus I have to do 90% or 100%, whatever it is. So it starts with trust. But I did some research, the current data on financial health and wellness, and I just brought out I'm a numbers geek, so sorry. 40% of Americans have less than $400 in savings. 40%, almost half. Over 24 million households are considered underserved or underbanked. And 30% are spending, savings, or borrowing at a level that's financially healthy. 1 in 3. And unfortunately, our minority population represents a large segment of that group. And until May 25th, until we started wanting to listen and understand, which prompted me to do this research to figure these things out, I really started to hear of Carolyn and some others and Stephanie, others speaking about what do we need to do? Boy, if we miss an opportunity, we should be in your community center talking about financial wellness because a path to home ownership has not been barrier-free for everyone. And so, the pride that comes along with home ownership. And so, to answer your question, Spencer, I think we have been caught in being comfortable that we believe we are very good reactively. Okay, if Tony comes in, I am confident that Tony's going to be treated just as equally as if Doug walks in. That's different, however, than how are we being proactively. And I think therein lies an opportunity for us. So I hope that answers
Absolutely.
the question. So Stephanie, I'll be calling you.
Anyone else? Another question? Okay, so I told you I was going to come with some prepared questions, just in case we got a little lull here. But before I go to any of my questions, anybody else want to share?
Just one thing.
Okay.
Back to the museum.
Back to the museum.
Another thing that happened in my visit there that really stopped me in my tracks is I stumbled upon the stone that was the slave block in Hagerstown, Maryland, and I thought, oh, that was not pleasant. And it was encased in a big glass case that sticks out, and you almost get to trip over it. But I thought, wow, you know, please go there if you have the opportunity.
Where is it?
In D.C.,
Okay.
it's on the mall.
Okay.
While we're talking about museums, I actually went to a museum back in like 8th grade, and then when I got married, I took my husband. He's from South Carolina, so he like a tiny small town, but the Great Blacks and Wax Museum in Baltimore. And so when you were saying your experience with the African American Museum, it took me back to being in 8th grade on a field trip with people of like every color. I went to high school in Frederick. It wasn't really that diverse, but my high school, my middle school, but now Frederick is really diverse. But I remember going there, and as soon as you walk into the museum, it's the slave ship, and it's like everyone piled on top of each other. So that kind of took me back to a memory, like, because I just kind of like was in your shoes. Like, man, I can remember being in 8th grade, this kid, and like walking in, and then that's the first thing you see. It's like really humbling. And it like, I think that probably lit a fire in me like really young. Like, I really need to do something. I'm not just going to like, you know, do nothing. So I can understand why you feel so passionate about like going to the museum, because it's the truth. It's not like what's watered down in the history books. And I feel like that's part of the problem too. It's like growing up, we weren't taught the correct history. We were taught what people wanted us to know. And so a lot of times people are so frustrated and angry at what's being taught in history, but we have to think about like that's what they were taught, and that's what the person before them was taught. So like a lot of times we're so angry and frustrated at certain people, when as a whole we all have to like come together and learn more, you know what I mean? And maybe relearn the things that we learned incorrectly. So that's just something I wanted to add.
And Tony, I think a lot of times people think, okay, the slaves were freed. And people think, well, they just picked up and packed up and moved and got jobs and everything. That's not true. That would be like giving a toddler a set of keys to the cruiser. And, you know, what do you do here? So, I mean, there's so much to think about. You know, it started here, but it hasn't ended. I mean, and when you start without a good basis and no support, it's just like, you're free to go now. So what happens? So there's just so much to talk about. So there's so much value in these conversations.
There's so much to talk about. There's so much to learn. And we get stuck. We get stuck sometimes. And so one of my first challenges here today is for people who are not Black to learn more about the history of slavery. And do it. Don't be afraid. It's there. It's okay. I say we were all bamboozled. we really, really were. And so just learn about it. Just learn about it. I'm looking, we have a comment from Facebook. And the comment is, what about a discussion on any Confederate statues here in Washington County? Does anyone want to offer any of that for comment?
Okay,
Or,
I'll take it.
or it doesn't even have to be in Washington County, any of the Confederate statues.
I think the big divide, the great divide is the way, Doug, you see it, or Mark, the way you see a Confederate flag or whatever, and then the way I see it. And I reflect to the fact that, with all due respect, South High used to fly that Confederate flag at football games and things. And I'm like, So, I mean, it's just what it means to me, what it means to Joey, you know. So, and we all are entitled to our opinions as to whether we want to look at those kind of things or not.
Tony, I'll offer this up. You know, you used the word bamboozled, and I think what's been terrific of what feels like is coming out of this is just what Carolyn shared. You know, as a youngster, I went to plenty of football games at South High at School Stadium. It never crossed my mind about that. I never even focused on it. And so now hearing this almost for the first time, not almost, hearing it for the first time, I get it. But I don't, from my perspective, it wasn't that when I looked at that and didn't have heartburn with it, it was more out of ignorance too. It wasn't because I supported it. It was just ignorance of how that affected other people. So to me, it's just where I came up short is just recognizing the impact on and how that may make others feel.
And I think on the level of statues, again, ignorance is that, if you go to any other country where a civil war would have happened, there would be no statues to the side that lost. There would not be. And the idea that these statues were put in place shortly after the Civil War is a misnomer. And that's kind of what I always thought when I saw statues around or saw those things. I thought they were done shortly after the war, and they were there. And again, ignorance, not knowing that that's, we grew up and the Civil War was part of the history of our country, and here's both sides, and you kind of lose that as Americans, that's unique to the United States. You're not going to find that anywhere else. And so there's value in statues in the context of education. So, at a battlefield, it's there for storytelling. It's not there to glorify. It's where it gets glorified that I think is where the issue comes in play. And again, there's going to be people that disagree with my comments on this, but ignorance is just that. I mean, until you start to learn and you start to hear, and again, my wife comes from, she's first generation American, and she talks about, in other countries, this would not happen, and you would not see this, and it's unique to American culture, and people are going to have heartburn over that. But if you're glorifying that, that's where I have a problem with it. Education component, I get that. That's a storytelling, that's a history, that's a learned thing. You want to remember that part of history because you don't want to repeat it. So, from the statue standpoint and from the Confederate flag standpoint, I went to North High and we went to those games and never thought twice about seeing the Confederate flag. Just didn't ring anything to me at all. And it wasn't until you get older and you learn the real history and you learn what that's all about that you realize that that's not a representation of what I want to be part of. So,
Isn't there so much more that we have to learn? There's so much more. More questions? More comments?
I have one more
So-
comment. And when I came here in the 60s, I came because I was fleeing Cuba because of the communist regime. But growing up, and it was, when I saw what was happening, it was an eye-opener because in Cuba, I'm sure there were racist people, not everywhere, but I grew up, and I'm a product of public education in Cuba, and I grew up going to school and black children, black students. We had the same teachers, we had the same classrooms, we talked the break time. There was no separate water fountain, no separate bathroom. So I was naive when I came, because when I came and I saw that, I said, oh dear God, I didn't know this existed. Why? Because I didn't grow up with that. Healthcare, and I'm talking before the Castro, before the communist regime. We had free education all the way up to the university. Tuition was free if the family couldn't pay for it. And healthcare was free. Black, white, Asians, there were a lot of Asians in Cuba. And so when I came, it was a surprise to me. I said, what is this? And because I didn't grow up with it, I didn't even know it existed.
I can add to that. So I was born and raised in DC, so it's kind of like the opposite. Like, I grew up, there wasn't really a lot of Hispanic or white people And so I went from being in DC where maybe there was like one Hispanic teacher to like a few Hispanic kids, maybe one or two white kids in the neighborhood. And then we moved to Frederick in 8th grade. And that was like a huge culture shock because I went from being like everyone looks like me to being maybe like 2 or 3 black children in like a classroom full of white people. And so like I can, you know, relate to that because it was a huge culture shock. It was the first time I ever experienced racism. It was the first time I realized I was different because it's just like, I know like people say things about DC, yes, it's violence and everything there, but it's violence everywhere. But the first time I ever experienced racism was like moving to Frederick, Maryland. And I'm like, oh, so we don't all just eat together? Like we don't all just hang out? And it's just like things that nobody talks about. Like I go to the gym, especially like my first day of high school. On one side of Frederick High, you have like, on one side of the bleachers, there's all the white kids. And then on the other side of the bleachers, there's all the black kids. And that was like really like shocking to me because I'm like, oh, I didn't realize like we still do this. Like this is what happens. So like I can definitely relate to that. And I hope, like I've been out of high school a while now, like things have changed and like everyone's like mixing together. But those are things that we don't talk about and I feel like we should. I pulled my kids out of public school here because I didn't like that there was no diversity. Like that's a problem to me. I don't want my children to go somewhere and they don't have a teacher that looks like them. Like that's important, you know, whether it just be the gym teacher or the science teacher. I feel like it's important that, you know, representation is really important. And I didn't want them to go through that same shock that I did leaving from DC to moving to Maryland. So I just wanted to add that.
And that's another point. I mean, I never made a teacher request except for once when my daughter was in 3rd grade, she had the opportunity to have a black female teacher. From kindergarten through her graduation, one teacher that looks like her. And then incidentally, in 3rd grade when we do Washington County history, she put together her little book and she announced that our family, the Williams family, owned Fort Frederick for a period of time. And it's not written in the history books that the kids are learning from. So she was challenged, like, well, how could your family, and especially your family, own a fort? But it's true, and I try and share that little nugget with everybody everywhere I go. And that's, you know, my family has deep roots in this community, and yes, we did own the fort for 57 years. And there are lots of interesting stories that go with that. So it's a matter of how history accounts for the real history. We need to go back and rewrite it, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and then there would be a better understanding as to the differences of opinions, not to say that we can't agree on things. So, I mean, it's important that we get the history right from the beginning.
You know, who controls the narrative, who writes the history books, has a impact on our total society, our total world. It's very important. I'm going to add this, and this is going to show a little bit of a recurring theme. When my children were in school, I always had to go and talk to the teachers. I remember when our youngest was going into 1st grade at this particular school, I made sure I made an appointment with the principal there. I wanted them to always know me. I wanted them to know that my children, we wanted them to know that our children have parents that care and will be here. I was one of the parents who was always on the trips. Until one day my child's class went to the Baltimore Zoo and I said, oh, they just wore me out. But it's so important, and that's a recurring theme that you hear here, that just in school, just the everyday things that some people don't have to think about, we have to think about it.
Right.
Extra.
Yeah, definitely. That's the extra. I mean, I
That's
volunteered
extra.
4,000 hours in school just so I knew what was happening with my child. I had to follow her career.
I want to ask a question, and it's a question that is really going towards our chief and our sheriff here. After the killing of Floyd, Mr. Floyd, you all have talked about it a little bit, and you said that none of your officers would have even thought that there was something totally wrong with that. Talk, yes, thank you. Talk about, if you can, some of the lessons that have been learned since that. And even, I can imagine that it's been a difficult several months as police officers. Talk about some of the tough times that they've endured even since then.
Sure. I can tell you that every one of my deputies that I've talked to who have viewed that video have said to me, there's absolutely no way that we would react that way. I can tell you from a sheriff's office, we, and as part of CALEA, we have to document every use of force. So far this year, we've had 14 use of forces. Only 2 have been African American, 1 Hispanic, and the rest have been white. We review each and every one. It goes first of all to, if it's a taser instructor that reviews it first, then it goes to the patrol commander, then it goes to the chief deputy, and it comes to me as the final reviewer. We look at all of those. I have an early warning system that if I see an officer who is showing a propensity for using use of force, then we will intervene in those types of things. But I have officers now who are also talking about getting out of law enforcement because of the scrutiny that is occurring. Just the fact that they're afraid that by doing their job that they're either A, going to get sued, or B, they're going to get thrown in jail for split-second decisions. I can tell you it's not easy making split-second decisions, and the chief and I were talking earlier about body cameras. Both agencies have body cameras, but that's not the panacea, because as you can see here, we have 4 cameras showing everything here. 1 camera can never show what an individual sees or perceives, and so that becomes an issue. We have great difficulty, even though we've gone into the African American communities to try to recruit. We have great difficulty getting African American who want to be in law enforcement or corrections. And I've been looking for ways, and I would certainly be open to any suggestions as to how we can correct that. I have some African Americans on my staff, but not nearly enough. And I think that's an issue for me that we need to work on and try to develop a way to correct that problem.
Okay. I'll give you one little tidbit. To recruit, I think you have to start with children very young, because we grow up sometimes with a history of the relationship between police officers and black people. And it's not necessarily a positive one. Sometimes it can be, but overall, so start very young and getting them to know you as individuals.
Do you think the school resource officer helps in that regard by being in the schools and having that relationship?
I don't know. It probably depends on the individual. It
right.
really does depend on the individual.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks for letting us know some of the tough times that your groups are going through, your teams are going through. Sure. Okay, thank you. Come right over here, Chief.
Yeah, it's been a tough couple months for the men and women. I agree that fear is there with some. I've actually lost 1 officer already to a private sector job as a result of, part of the result of this. The other thing we've seen just in the last couple of testing cycles we've had since all this is gone is our testing numbers are going down. The amount of people actually applying in general has dramatically dropped off. Not that it was at a real high before this, but it's dramatically dropped off. We work on diversity, not for the sake of diversity, not just to be politically correct and say we want to just represent our community. That's part of it, but having diverse cultures and races on our police department helps to educate the guys that are actually working side by side with each other. And the other part of that is it helps the community see someone that looks like them, doing the job as well. But it's twofold there. You get that, and something Sila said earlier about her accent and being prejudiced against that. I've got very first Muslim American police officer in our police department. He's originally from Lebanon. Very heavy accent. And when he was going through our process and interview, some of the comments that came from the men and women that sat on those panels for us was that they were concerned about his accent being too heavy and that it might cause him problems. That's an implicit bias that wasn't necessarily say don't hire him. It was just they were saying that they didn't have that experience, and that has not been an issue since he's come on board, and I don't hear any of that anymore. So that's there with that. It's tough. I've got 5 African American police officers on my department, and that's not near what it needs to be a true representation of our community. We've got female officers on our department that at a higher rate than the national average, and I'm proud of some of those things, but we're working really hard with that. But it's tough. I think it gets easier. The more minorities that come onto the department makes it more acceptable for other minorities that want to apply. They see there's a trust, as Mark brought up earlier, there's a trust that is built through what you see and in those actions. So it's been tough. The men and women feel like they're being targeted for something that they didn't do. And I've explained to them that that's something we have to own as a profession and to learn from that, to take that experience of being viewed as something that you're not because of the uniform you wear is essentially professional racism. The difference is I can take the uniform off and people don't look at me like that anymore. You can't change the color of your skin. You live with that every day, all day. So it's a learning experience for us to get a feeling of what you guys have felt and experienced in your life at a professional level. So I've tried to explain that to the guys to take and learn from that and move forward. They're getting better. As Doug said, we've got a early warning system we put in place for us as well. It's part of CLIA standards anyway. We've had it in place for quite some time. We have worked on doing a near use of force review, something we never did before, to look for even an early warning system. Where someone's threatening, I'm gonna tase you if you don't put your hands behind your back. We're reviewing those at a training staff level to see if there's any other issues we could hit even before something else would happen. So we're putting in additional steps to review. We're working with a team to kind of figure those things out. So we got a lot of issues that we're working through. I've put together an advisory committee, citizen advisory committee, that's going to be looking at our training and our policies to see, so we can allow our community to help us know how they want to be policed and to understand how we do things and why we do things. As Carolyn said, you learn so that they can learn as well why we do the things we do, and then we can learn from them what their concerns are. So those are things that we put into place that we're working on now.
Okay, thank you both. And I'm really glad to hear the different statistics that you are keeping as well. And that leads us, what you just said, leads us right to a question from Facebook. And it was the question, do the police departments do comprehensive diversity training? I'm not sure what that comprehensive means, but that was the question. So if you could just speak about just the type of diversity and inclusion training that you might do. And diversity and inclusion training absolutely includes implicit bias training. It's a part of it.
So we, about 5 years ago, Fair and Impartial Policing organization actually came in and trained staff from both the Sheriff's Department and the Hagerstown Police Department I've got upwards of almost 10 people that have been trained in instruction on implicit bias, and I know Doug has probably almost about the same that was there. We went through extensive training on that, and started implementing that back about 5 years ago. So we train our officers on implicit bias to have that understanding that we all carry that we all carry implicit biases with us, and that is normal. That is not something that's going to go away, and that for law enforcement, it's about how to keep us safe. It's not to say you're being racist or sexist, but it's to keep you safe. We give an example in the training where you walk into a setting where there's a female sitting in the middle and a male sitting off to the other side, and the male's consoling the female in the middle, saying, "I promise you it'll never happen again," and you got a call for disturbance, and you show up, and when you walk in and you present this, you ask anyone, "What do you think happened here?" He assaulted her. He committed some kind of domestic battery on her. And then when you go through the scenario and you realize that the partners were the two females, not the male and the female, and that the female sitting there could possibly have a weapon and now put the officer in danger. So that implicit bias carries way beyond just race, comes in every shape or form. All of you have watched America's Got Talent, the very first year when Susan Boyle came out and sang, and what did everybody think about Susan Boyle when she walked on stage? Everyone had that implicit bias towards her until she opened her mouth and that beautiful voice came out. So it's training on that to the men and women of the police department to say, you carry this with you. It's how you act on that what dictates the results of those things. So we've done implicit bias. We continue to work on implicit bias, and then I know they get a lot in the academy. Again, things that we probably need to even work more on, and that's where the advisory committee I'm hoping is going to help us along with that as well.
Absolutely.
And if I can add to that,
Absolutely.
the state of Maryland has a Maryland Standards and Police Training Commission, which is in actually in Baltimore area. And so there's a lot of diversity and a lot of individuals on that training commission that are not police officers. There are people professors from colleges, there's psychiatrists, there's people from the community, et cetera. And one of the things that we have to do as part of the training critique from them is diversity training. And so it is taught in our police academy. We have a great relationship with Hagerstown Community College. Our police academy is here now, and we actually, the city police and the sheriff's office actually do that training academy, and so we're very proud of that. But I also wanted to relay an incident that occurred, it's been a few years back now. I had an African-American deputy who was called to a home, an elderly lady had a theft, and she would not allow him into to her home, basically because he was black. And we called her on the phone and explained to her, and he was in uniform and everything, and she absolutely would not. She just refused. So there is a lot of issues still within our community. I called that deputy in and spoke to him afterwards, and I apologized to him for her actions. But I'm sure that affected him for quite some time. He ultimately left our department, went down to Texas. So it does occur.
Yeah, it does occur. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you. And here's another question from Facebook. Does the police department have social workers who go out with them?
We have crisis intervention members who are mental health. Mental health is a huge issue in our community. They are on an on-call basis. They all have radios. I actually donated a car to that team, and they do respond. So when an officer gets on a scene and they find that there are issues of mental health and so forth, then we will call that team to come out and actually control that situation. We also have what's called LEADS, a law enforcement diversion program, where if it's a minor offense, that we will divert them away from the criminal justice system so that they don't get caught up into that, that we can provide them counseling and other types of services that they may need that's more important. And both the Hagerstown Police Department and the Sheriff's Office participate in that. So.
Okay.
We also have jointly officers that have been sent to 40 hours of crisis intervention training that's specifically directed towards mental health issues. So majority of the departments, both sides, have been sent to that training to enhance that understanding of people with mental illness and those situations again, so we don't run into those problems. So yeah, we worked hand in hand with Turning Point and some others to put together the crisis intervention team. There's a response team as well for addictions that we work with through the health department. So we've been brought in, we've worked on that. We've been doing that for a couple years now, so this is not something new for us.
Okay, thank you, thank you. I said in the very beginning that our time was going to go by very fast. It's gone by. We are right at the end. I think we probably have maybe 2 minutes left, if 2 minutes. So I understand there's been a very active, engaged conversation going on with comments in Facebook. I want to thank everybody in Facebook for participating, for watching, for being a part of it. I want to thank everybody here also. There are so many more questions. There are questions I even had that I wanted to still ask, but we just can't do it all in this. I also want to say that this is a piece of what needs to be done. Chief, you mentioned a couple of times, it's got to go deeper. We've got to get into the more or the less public locations and start peeling some things back and having real conversations, doing real work, looking to the future even more. We've got to do that. Any more questions? Any more comments? As I look out, I want to say an extra thank you also to all of the team who is here working the cameras and the microphones and just doing a really good role. We appreciate that. Again, thank you to Hagerstown Community College overall. Thank you very much to the Washington County Chamber of Commerce. Again, thank you all of the participants here. I'm so glad to have met you all. I appreciate it very much. And any last comments from anybody here? Well then, I think I get to say this. It's a wrap. Thank you, everyone. Great job. Thank you.